Have you ever stopped to think that the clean clothes you wear every day, a symbol of comfort and freshness, were in past centuries the result of sweat, pain, and even life threatening risks? It seems exaggerated, but it's not. While today it's enough to press a button on the washing machine, in the Middle Ages, every piece of fabric was earned through chapped hands, freezing water, and hours of invisible labor. The curious and even controversial thing is that these women, the washerwomen, never received prestige for this. They were seen as common, almost irrelevant figures, when in fact, they carried the dignity of an entire society in their arms. And perhaps you realize that something similar still happens today. How many people continue to sustain the world in silence without being remembered? It's counterintuitive to think that the most boring part of that routine also hid immense power. With each piece of clothing beaten against the stone, it wasn't just dirt that was removed, it was history being preserved. Simple tasks became grand, even if no one paid attention. And understanding this process can change the way you view even the most mundane tasks in your life. Brace yourself. The story of medieval washerwomen isn't just about clothes, rivers, and soap. It's about resilience, community, struggle, and above all, how the past still resonates in the present. And I guarantee that after listening to the end, you'll never look at a clothesline the same way again. By the way, I want to extend an invitation to you. Comment below where you're from and what time it is now. It'll be incredible to see how many places and at how many different times the story is being heard. Back then, amidst the narrow, muddy streets, stood an almost invisible, yet absolutely indispensable figure, the washerwoman. She was the one who shouldered the responsibility of keeping the entire community's clothes clean. While kings and nobles were remembered in chronicles and songs, it was these women who silently ensured the minimum order of daily life. Today, when someone puts clothes in the washing machine and forgets even the noise, it's hard to realize how much of an unattainable privilege this act once was. The medieval washerwoman didn't work for vanity or luxury. She worked out of necessity for the village's survival. Imagine for a moment an entire village with no one to wash the daily fabrics. The smell would quickly spread, and coexistence would become unbearable. It's curious how something so simple, seemingly banal, had enormous weight in maintaining community life. It was a nearly invisible service, but one that upheld collective dignity. Along the riverbanks, these women transformed what seemed routine into something vital. It was as if each bead of cloth against stone was a rhythm of medieval life, ensuring that priests had their cassocks clean, soldiers their tunics in order, and peasants their attire minimally presentable. And mind you, we're talking about a time when hygiene was precarious, and any basic care could mean the difference between health and illness. This essential role of washerwomen shows how power doesn't always rest with those who govern, but often with those who serve. Today's housewife may not see herself as a pillar of society, but one need only look at history to understand. Without someone to take care of the small tasks, the world doesn't function. And it is in this detail that the medieval washerwoman finds parallels with so many modern professions that go unnoticed, but without which the gears of daily life simply grind to a halt. It's also interesting to consider how much this craft shaped the village's rhythm. Washing clothes led to meetings, sparked conversations, and even organized the days. While today people arrange meetings at the office or in cafes, back then the meeting place was the river. There, with their feet in the icy water, the female community forged invisible bonds, as strong as the seams of the fabrics they washed. It was hard work, yes, but it was also social. And perhaps it is precisely in this contrast that the greatness of this function lies. What seemed repetitive, monotonous, and even boring was actually the foundation of medieval coexistence. Because if each clean garment brought comfort and respect, it was thanks to the washerwoman that the collective continued to move forward. And of course, this opens a curious gap for us to understand how these rituals took on new forms when the water didn't come from the river, but from buildings built for this purpose. On the river banks, the constant sound of the current mingled with the sound of clothes being beaten against the rocks. The ever moving water was the natural ally of these women, who saw in its constant flow the most effective way to remove dirt. Medieval life revolved around the resources nature provided, and the river was simultaneously a source of food, transportation, and cleansing. It's curious to think how, today, simply turning on the tap provides the same resource in seconds. The scene always seemed the same: colorful clothes made of linen or wool floating in the icy waters while calloused hands repeated themselves in mechanical movements. There was no luxury or choice, only the certainty that the river would be a silent witness to endless labor. The body bent, the back ached, but the current helped carry away some of the effort. Today, when someone complains about the weight of a bag of laundry, they can hardly imagine the magnitude of the contrast. The river was also a communal space, and this was part of the routine. No one washed clothes alone. The river was a meeting place, a place to share confidences and laughter muffled by the wind. With each bucket dipped, a new story was told, a new piece of advice shared. It's like when someone gathers with friends around a table today to talk about life. Only back then, the table was liquid, cold, and in motion. It's worth noting that running water was more than a convenience, it was a necessity. If clothes were left in stagnant water, dirt wouldn't wash off well, and bad odors would quickly spread. The practical intelligence of these women was impressive. Without scientific theories or hygiene manuals, they understood that running water was synonymous with efficiency. This shows how practical knowledge often precedes any formal study. Life teaches what books later, but like everything in life, there were challenges. In the harsh winters, the river water cut through their skin like a blade of ice, making every wetsuit a small sacrifice. Often, their fingers went numb, but the work had to go on. It's like that feeling of washing dishes in cold water when the heater runs out of gas, only multiplied by hours of daily effort. And yet they persevered without complaining too much, because they knew there was no alternative. And so, the habit of washing clothes in flowing rivers was not only a practical matter, but also a cultural one. It was how the community organized itself, met and held together around something seemingly banal. And it's precisely at this point that curiosity arises. If the river was so essential, what happened when there was no one nearby? Here comes another curious element of medieval life. When the river wasn't nearby, human creativity found a solution. Community tanks emerged. Made of stone or wood, they were built in the center of villages, almost like a public good, owned by everyone. And for the idea was simple but ingenious: store enough water so that washerwomen could perform their duties without having to make long treks to the distant banks. It was medieval practicality in action. These tanks ended up becoming meeting points as important as squares or markets. Imagine a large stone container, always full, surrounded by women chatting while scrubbing fabrics. The sound of water hitting the cloths echoed like a soundtrack to everyday life. Curiously, Even unintentionally, that place was also a stage for gossip, advice, and even subtle disputes over space. There was something communal about this habit that seems to have been lost today. Consider the difference. Nowadays, every home has its own washing machine, isolating the task within four walls. Back then, washing clothes meant getting together, sharing stories, and sharing silences. It was like a community cafe, but instead of hot cups, there were ice cold buckets. And this detail gave the work an almost social dimension, as well as a practical one. The tanks, however, were not without their difficulties. Without the river's natural current, the stagnant water could quickly become murky, requiring frequent changes. Some villages organized rotations to keep the tank clean, which required collective discipline. It's curious to note how necessity shaped cooperation. Everyone knew that if the tank was neglected, no one would benefit. It was the medieval version of if the neighborhood doesn't cooperate, everyone suffers. The material also made a difference. Stone tanks were more durable, but required heavy labor to build. Wooden ones, while easier to build, wore out quickly and required maintenance. It was a choice between durability and practicality, a dilemma we still face today in so many areas of life. After all, who hasn't wondered whether it's worth investing in something long lasting or opting for something that solves the immediate problem? And in the end, these community tanks weren't just reservoirs of water, they were reservoirs of memories, encounters, and stories. Each wet stone bore the mark of collective effort. And this dynamic leads us to consider another fascinating detail. Within these spaces, how were tasks organized among so many hands, so many clothes, and so many voices? In the washerwomen's world, nothing was done haphazardly. There was a natural division of labor that maintained a steady flow of work. Some women dedicated themselves to beating the clothes on the stones, others focused on scrubbing with rudimentary soap, while the rest took care of the final rinse. This organization seemed instinctive, but it demonstrated how essential cooperation was for the entire village to remain clean and orderly. This division also reflected the diversity of strengths and abilities. The younger ones, with plenty of energy, were responsible for the more demanding steps, such as beating fabrics forcefully against the stone. The older ones, who had accumulated experience, preferred to scrub carefully, ensuring that stubborn stains were removed. It was a subtle balance, almost like an orchestra, with each instrument playing its part in the ensemble. Nothing worked well without harmony. It's curious to think that this logic still recurs in many areas of life today. Within a family, for example, each member ends up taking on specific roles: who cooks, who organizes, who pays the bills. In the workplace, it's the same. Some lead, others execute, some review. It's as if somehow this medieval division has left its mark on how society continues to operate centuries later. Interestingly, besides speeding up the process, this division allowed the women to chat and bond without losing rhythm. While one woman beat, another would scrub, and the third would ensure everything ended clean. It was like watching a human chain of silent efficiency. The very sound of clothes against the stones seemed to mark the rhythm of this collective work, a repetitive, almost hypnotic sound that lulled the daily routine. This dynamic also taught the children something important, as they watched their mothers and quickly understood the logic of collaboration. They learned from an early age that there is no progress without shared responsibility. It's the same lesson that still resonates today. Alone, you can go faster, but together you go much further. A value that spans generations, from the riverbank to the present day. And amidst this coordinated movement, there was also a revealing detail. Even in seemingly simple tasks, there existed an invisible hierarchy, an order that needed to be respected. This order wasn't written in law, but it was present in the root, and this leads us to consider another essential aspect: the instruments that supported this daily practice. Observing a medieval washerwoman, it was impossible not to notice the simplicity of her tools. There was nothing sophisticated: a wooden board, a smooth stone taken from the river itself, and a mixture of vegetable ash that served as soap. These objects, so common and yet indispensable, turned the impossible into routine. What to us today is a noisy electric machine, to them was simply the strength of their arms combined with the ingenuity of nature. Wooden boards were used to scrub clothes, replacing what we now know as the friction of the washing machine drum. The smooth stones found on the banks were true allies, firm, resistant, and always ready to withstand the impact of fabrics being beaten repeatedly. Each beat echoed like a kind of ritual, reminding everyone that manual labor was above all an art of persistence. Soap, on the other hand, was a separate invention, made from vegetable ash mixed with animal fat. It had a strong odor and an unpleasant texture. However, it did its job of dissolving dirt. It's curious to note how centuries later, this same rudimentary formula gave rise to the bar soap we still know today. In other words, when you turn up your nose at a modern day product, it's worth remembering that it has roots in much more rustic and harsh practices. This set of tools also reveals something about the mentality of the time, using what was available without waiting for the ideal. It wasn't about having the best stone or the most polished board, but about making work with whatever was at hand. This thinking, when brought to the present day, reminds us of the value of improvisation. How often do we solve modern problems with simple creative solutions that arise in times of need? Of course, there were difficulties. The boards cracked, the stones broke, the soap irritated the skin, but none of this interrupted the journey. It's like that old cell phone that no longer responds properly, but still works. You keep using it until it gives out. The medieval washerwoman did the same, prolonging the life of her tools as much as possible, because she knew getting new ones wouldn't always be easy. Resilience was part of everyday life, and it's fascinating to see how these tools, though simple, shaped the way people worked, and even the rhythm of the villages. Each object carried a silent story of sweat, effort, and adaptation, but behind them there was also a constant search for something more efficient, which manifested itself in the evolution of another, even more curious resource: the invention of rail soap. In medieval times, soap was almost a luxury. Most washerwomen had to make do with rustic mixtures of animal fat and natural caustic soda, the result of the reaction between ash and water. The smell was strong, the texture unpleasant, but the effect was undeniable. It helped dissolve dirt embedded in fabrics. Interestingly, despite its rudimentary nature, this formula was the precursor to the soap we know today. Producing this soap required patience and practice. First, they collected the fat from slaughtered animals, often unsuitable for human consumption. Then, they mixed it with lye, made by filtering the ash. The process seemed almost magical, transforming two unattractive elements into a useful product. Today, we buy detergents scented with lavender or vanilla. Back then, the fragrance was, let's say, much less inviting. This detail about the soap teaches us the value of transformation. What seemed like discarded material gained a new purpose, reminding us that nothing was wasted. Grease, which could attract pests, became a cleaning ally. This logic still applies in the modern world. Recycling, reusing, repurposing. How many times did something that seemed useless prove essential in times of need? Medieval life was like that, always teaching through simplicity. Using soap, however, wasn't without its problems. It irritated the skin, caused wounds on the washerwomen's hands, and required them to develop a strong sense of resistance. Even so, no one stopped using it because they knew it made their work easier. This reality demonstrates the strength of those who endure discomfort for the sake of greater results. It's like studying late at night, tired, but knowing that dedication will open doors in the future. It's also curious to consider how the absence of perfumes and softeners transformed the experience. The clothes came out clean, but without the pleasant aroma we're accustomed to. Freshness came only from the wind and sun, free and ever present element, and in a way, this natural scent must have conveyed a different sense of purity connected to the earth, the water, the very cycle of life, a simplicity that has almost been lost today. And so, medieval soap, crude and imperfect, sustained a practice that went far beyond cleanliness. It was a symbol of ingenuity, survival, and feminine resilience. But of course, none of this would make sense without the constant ally that sustained the entire process, running water itself, a vital element that deserves special attention. In medieval life, running water was seen almost as a divine gift. Without it, the washerwomen's work would be simply impossible. The current's function was to wash away dirt, to carry away residues that would otherwise remain embedded in the fabric. It was a natural process, without great mysteries, but it demonstrated how practical wisdom preceded scientific knowledge. After all, only much later would what they already knew in practice be explained chemically. Stagnant water was no good. On the contrary, it accumulated a foul odor and did nothing to aid rinsing the stain. Therefore, the washerwomen sought strategic points along the rivers where the current was strong enough to carry away the dirt. This choice required experience, almost like that of a fisherman knowing the best place to cast his net. Each washerwoman had her favorite spot, and rarely left it, as if the river also held personal secret. Interestingly, this medieval practice holds a modern lesson. In our lives, we also need flows that carry away what no longer serves us. Just as running water purifies the fabric, certain decisions and changes purify our minds and routines. Who hasn't felt relief in letting go of something that weighed them down? A toxic friendship, an unsatisfying job, or even a harmful habit. The river silently teaches us about the power of renewal. The final rinse was almost a celebration, symbolizing the end of the arduous process of washing. Seeing the clothes floating clean in the running water must have brought a quiet satisfaction, like observing the results of well-applied effort. It's similar to the pleasure we feel today when we see the progress bar reach 100% completion on a long computer task. Small signs that the hard work truly paid off. It's also important to remember the symbolism of water in medieval culture. More than just physical cleansing, it represented spiritual purification. The same waters used to wash clothes were used in baptisms and religious rituals. This deep connection made the river an almost sacred space, even when used for such mundane tasks. A reminder that amidst routine, there was always room for the sacred. And so, running water became more than a resource. It became a central character, silent but essential. Without it, the entire process of the washerwomen would be meaningless. And precisely because of its importance, a curious detail emerged that further shaped this daily routine, the type of clothing that most required this constant care. In the Middle Ages, clothing revolved primarily around two materials, linen and wool. Linen was cool, ideal for the warmer months, while wool protected from the harsh cold. However, both shared a common challenge. They were difficult to keep clean, much less white. The porous and heavy fabric easily absorbed dirt, making the laundry routine a true test of patience for washerwomen. Linen, when new, had a light hue and even conveyed a certain elegance, but it only took a few weeks of use to lose its initial shine. Wool, on the other hand, being thick and rough, retained odors for much longer. Imagine the effort of beating a heavy soaked fabric against a cold stone until it loosened some of the dirt. Today, when someone bothers to scrub a simple gravy stain, they have no idea what it was like to tackle entire yards of medieval fabric. White clothes were even more challenging. Keeping them white meant repeated rinsing, leaving them exposed to the sun for longer, and even resorting to tricks like soaking them in bleaching herbal infusions. It was almost a game of persistence, and it wasn't just about aesthetics. Light colored clothes were a sign of status, as they required more care and therefore more effort from the laundresses. Anyone who appeared in well cared for fabrics immediately commanded respect. This detail shows us how even fabrics influenced social organization. While peasants were content with dark, stained clothing, noble families demanded frequent washing and impeccable results. The contrast was evident and reinforced class differences. It's like today when someone compares a simple outfit bought on sale with a designer suit. It's not just a fabric, it's a symbol of social status. The durability of these materials, however, also brought advantages. A woolen garment could last for years, lasting a person's entire life, sometimes even being passed down through generations. Linen, on the other hand, even stained, was lightweight and practical for everyday use. This durability compensated for the effort of washing. Unlike today's consumption, where fashion is disposable, each medieval piece was a valuable possession, almost like a family investment. And in this process, the washerwomen ended up becoming guardians of others' dignity. After all, they weren't just washing fabrics, but symbols of honor, status, and belonging. And this leads us to wonder, if clothing was so difficult to care for, what happened to the body that wore it, exposed to the cold and heat during this constant washing process? If one could observe a medieval washerwoman up close, one would notice the intensity of each gesture. Beating clothes against stones required brute strength, wringing them out, still wet, required resilient muscles. There was no prolonged rest. The repetitive movement lasted for hours until hands were swollen and arms ached. It was almost like a gym workout, only without personal trainers, lively music, and no choice. It was routine, period. This physical exertion left visible marks. Backs bent early, fingers grew calloused, and joints began to show signs of wear even before old age. Today, someone might complain of shoulder pain after an afternoon of typing on a computer, but in the Middle Ages, washerwomen's bodies bore the consequences of incessant work from an early age. Wear and tear was the price of keeping the community clean, and it's curious to think how this effort, though painful, also brought a kind of discipline. The repetition of the movements recalled the rituals of monks copying manuscripts or soldiers training exhaustively. There was a cadence, a rhythm that transformed the burden into habit. Perhaps that's why, despite their fatigue, many remained steadfast, as if their bodies had adapted to this reality. It was almost automatic, and yet there was no recognition to match. No one applauded these women's strength. No one awarded them medals for their performance. The merit lay in fulfilling their silent duty, day after day. This lack of recognition makes us reflect on how, even today, many arduous tasks remain invisible. Cleaning, garbage collection, maintenance, we only notice when something's wrong, otherwise it goes unnoticed, as in the past. Physical exertion also shaped the mind. By repeating movements for hours, thoughts, reflections, and even rhythmic chants emerged that helped bear the weight of the task. It was like transforming the effort into a kind of practical meditation. Anyone who has washed clothes by hand knows the repetitive movement calms and organizes ideas, almost as if the mind were washing itself along with the fabric. Perhaps, in the silence of the beats, a silent wisdom was born. And it's precisely in this contrast between pain and discipline that an inevitable question arises. If the washerwomen's bodies were already suffering so much from the weight and repetition, how did they find relief in the midst of this process? The answer, curiously, came from an unexpected ally, the sun itself, which played a fundamental role after all this effort. After so much effort beating, wringing, and rinsing clothes, a silent ally stepped in. The sun. It was the sun that completed the job, whitening the fabrics and restoring a fresh appearance. Hanging the clothes in the fields or on wooden fences wasn't just a final detail, it was an essential step. The sun's rays acted as a kind of natural bleach, long before any chemical product existed. Laundresses knew from experience that the longer fabrics were exposed to the sun, the brighter and more fragrant they became. There was no formal scientific explanation, but there was practice. The light removed light stains, eliminated some odors, and brought a sense of purity. It's curious to think that today, amid electric clotheslines and automatic dryers, many still recognize nothing beats the smell of clothes dried in the wind and sun. The act of hanging clothes out also had a symbolic quality. Seeing the fabric gently swaying, reflecting the light, was almost a sign of victory. After so much physical exertion, that scene conveyed relief and reward. It's similar to the satisfaction of completing a difficult project and finally seeing the result before your eyes. The medieval clothesline, therefore, was more than practical, it was poetic, even if no one said it out loud. Furthermore, the sun brought a sense of community. Rows of exposed clothing became a typical village landscape, almost like flags, representing each family. Each sheet, or tunics, spread out told a story about the daily lives of those who lived there. It was a kind of silent mural, made of fabric, wind, and light, a free exhibition visible to all who passed by. Something that unintentionally reinforced the sense of community. We mustn't forget that at the same time there were challenges. On rainy days, all the effort seemed wasted, as without sunlight, clothes took a long time to dry and developed an unpleasant odor. This demonstrated the direct dependence on nature. Today, when we turn on a dryer in any season, we forget this detail. Medieval life was shaped by the unpredictability of the weather. Routines didn't follow the clock, but the sky. And so, the sun became more than just a natural resource. It was the washerwomen's partner, completing a process begun with human effort and completed with the generosity of light. But beyond the bright, dry laundry, there was also the human aspect. The sun created the perfect setting for conversation, laughter, and sharing, opening the way for a closer look at these women's collective routines. At first glance, it might seem like just another day of hard work, but for the washerwomen, the river or the communal tank was also a place for socializing. There, between one beat of the cloth and the next, conversations about children, harvests, illnesses, and even funny stories from the village would emerge. It was a place where physical exertion blended with social. The act of washing clothes wasn't solitary, it was collective, almost like a scheduled meeting. This communal space made a difference in the lives of these women. In a world where domestic chores were isolating, the river became a haven of conversation and complicity. Difficulties were shared, as were the small pleasures. It's like that coffee with colleagues in the modern workplace. It's not just a break, it's a moment of connection. There, the ache in their arms was soothed by the laughter echoing along the current. Interestingly, this social space also shaped local culture. Many oral traditions were passed down from generation to generation. Songs, proverbs, and even legends were passed from mouth to mouth while the laundry was being scrubbed. Without realizing it, the washerwomen became guardians of the collective memory. It was like a living library, where each conversation added a chapter to the community's history. This coexistence further strengthened bonds of solidarity. When someone was absent, it was immediately noticed, and questions arose. Are you sick? Do you need help? On many occasions, women shared tasks to ease each other's burdens. This collaborative spirit revealed that work wasn't just about clean clothes, but about keeping the village's social fabric alive. Ultimately, washing was also about caring for one another. Of course, there was room for small tensions. Arguments about who had the best spot on the river or who was taking too long also occurred. After all, coexistence breeds friction. But curiously, even these conflicts helped reinforce the group's importance. Resolving differences, reconnecting, and moving on were part of the cycle. And so, between the water and the foam, people also learned about tolerance and coexistence. And this collective nature, full of voices and stories, gave the act of washing clothes a dimension that went beyond cleaning. It was social life in motion, made of noise, confidences, and muffled laughter. And within this shared routine, there were striking sounds that became inseparable from the image of the washerwomen. At first glance, it might seem like just another day of hard work. But for the washerwomen, the river or the communal tank was also a place for socializing. There, between one beat of the cloth and the next, conversations about children, harvests, illnesses, and even funny stories from the village would emerge. It was a place where physical exertion blended with social life. The act of washing clothes wasn't solitary, it was collective, almost like a scheduled meeting. This communal space made a difference in the lives of these women. In a world where domestic chores were isolating, the river became a haven of conversation and complicity. Difficulties were shared, as were the small pleasures. It's like that coffee with colleagues in the modern workplace. It's not just a break, it's a moment of connection. There, the ache in their arms was soothed by the laughter echoing along the current. Interestingly, the social space also shaped local culture. Many oral traditions were passed down from generation to generation. Songs, proverbs, and even legends were passed from mouth to mouth while the laundry was being scrubbed. Without realizing it, the washerwomen became guardians of the collective memory. It was like a living library, where each conversation added a chapter to the community's history. This coexistence further strengthened bonds of solidarity. When someone was absent, it was immediately noticed, and questions arose. Are you sick? Do you need help? On many occasions, women shared tasks to ease each other's burden. This collaborative spirit revealed that work wasn't just about clean clothes, but about keeping the village's social fabric alive. Ultimately, washing was also about caring for one another. Of course, there was room for small tensions. Arguments about who had the best spot on the river or who was taking too long also occurred. After all, coexistence breeds friction. But curiously, even these conflicts helped reinforce the group's importance. Resolving differences, reconnecting, and moving on were part of the cycle. And so, between the water and the foam, people also learned about tolerance and coexistence. And this collective nature, full of voices and stories, gave the act of washing clothes a dimension that went beyond cleaning. It was social life in motion, made of noise, confidences, and muffled laughter. And within this shared routine, there were striking sounds that became inseparable from the image of the washerwomen. While hands were busy beating, scrubbing, and wringing clothes, mouths were not silent. The heavy work was made lighter by the trivial conversations that naturally arose. People talked about children, harvests, arranged marriages, and of course, the gossip that circulated around the village. The river didn't just wash fabrics, it was also a place to cleanse the soul, soothe worries, and share joys. These conversations had a special flavor. The repetitive and tiring routine became companionship when filled with stories and laughter. A washerwoman told of her son learning to walk. Another shared her fear of a disease that was stalking the village. With each exchange, the invisible network of female support grew stronger. It was a space where personal dramas found echo and comfort in the voices of friends. And the gossip? Oh, there was no shortage of it. Who had been seen holding hands at the market? Which family was struggling to pay taxes? Which young woman was about to be proposed to? These comments crossed the waters and became the talk of the week. Interestingly, they served as a way to keep the community informed. Today, we have newspapers, social media, and messaging groups. Back then, the riverbank was the news channel. This habit of conversation also revealed a profound detail: the human need to transform work into coexistence. The weight of clothes seemed to diminish when accompanied by a good story. It's like when someone faces heavy traffic but finds companionship in the radio or a podcast that eases the weight. The conversation didn't change the physical effort, but it did change the feeling of facing it alone. Furthermore, these conversations created lasting memories. Many children, playing near their mothers, grew up listening to stories that would remain etched in their memories. The riverside, therefore, was both a school of life and a natural laundry. They learned about relationships, faith, the hardships of life, and the small pleasures hidden in everyday life. It was an indirect learning experience, transmitted without books, only through word of mouth. And amidst so much trivial dialogue, one thing stood out: men were rarely seen participating in this space. It was a female dominated, almost exclusive environment, which reinforced the idea that certain tasks belonged solely to women. And this division of roles in medieval society opens up space for us to reflect on the social restrictions imposed on women at that time. In the Middle Ages, washing clothes wasn't just a matter of necessity, but also of gender. Society rigidly determined who did what, and laundry was almost always reserved for women. No one expected to see a man bent over stones, beating fabric. Such a scene simply wasn't part of the imagination of the time. The work was associated with the feminine world, like so many other domestic tasks. This restriction was not only cultural, but also symbolic. By assigning women to wash clothes, society reinforced the idea that their place was in care, maintenance, and silent service. It was as if the river were a mirror of imposed destiny, to flow within limits without question. And although heavy and exhausting, the work did not receive the recognition it deserved. On the contrary, it was seen as natural, as if it were an obligation. Interestingly, this division of roles still resonates today. How often, even today, do we hear phrases like, "that's a woman's job," or "that role isn't suited to men"? Medieval logic persists, albeit disguised. It's a reminder of how certain beliefs take centuries to change. Just look inside your home and notice who still takes on the majority of household chores. The pattern is ancient, ingrained, and resilient. For the washerwomen, this social restriction also meant that the river was a nearly exclusive female space. There, they could talk, laugh, cry, and share secrets without the presence of men. Amidst the weight of their clothes and the harshness of their routine, they also found a certain freedom. Interestingly, what was imposed as a limitation was, in practice, transformed into an opportunity for coexistence and mutual strengthening. The space of restriction became a space of unity. This exclusivity, however, also created inequalities. While men dedicated themselves to work seen as noble crafts, war, commerce, women were associated with invisible tasks. It was as if half of society was responsible for sustaining daily life without ever appearing in the chronicles. Washerwomen were, in this sense, anonymous guardians of order, forgotten by official history, invisible but indispensable. And it's in this contrast that something intriguing emerges. Even limited by social roles, the washerwomen managed to pass on their strength from generation to generation. Often, they were accompanied by their own daughters, who learned from an early age to handle the weight of water and fabrics. And so, the river was not only a place of work, but also a kind of school, where learning began in childhood. By the riverside, it wasn't just the women who gathered. The children, small and curious, were also always nearby, watching their mother's every move. While they beat and wrung out clothes, the children played on the bank, ran among the buckets, or simply imitated the adults' gestures in miniature. It was a noisy, lively scene where learning happened naturally and inevitably. From an early age, boys and girls understood that the household routine required constant effort. For girls, there was a clear expectation one day they would take their mother's place, repeating every gesture, every ironing of clothes. Boys, though not destined for this role, grew up recognizing the hardships of women's work. It was a kind of practical school, teaching responsibility, discipline, and community even before they learned to read. This interaction also shaped emotional memories. Many adults, when recalling their childhood, might recall the sound of water, the smell of rustic soap, and the sight of their mother bent over the stone. These memories, though linked to hard work, also held a human warmth. It's like when someone today remembers their grandmother baking bread in a wood-fired oven. It wasn't just about the bread, but about the affection that surrounded that ritual. Interestingly, this childlike presence revealed how multifunctional the river space was. There they learned about coexistence, respect for elders, and cooperation. There were no formal classrooms, but teaching was conveyed through gestures, stories, and even scoldings received for playing too much in the clean water. It was life teaching without notebooks, in a silent but effective pedagogy. An open-air school, free, and continuous. It's interesting to compare this with today. Today, many children are removed from household chores, almost shielded from the daily routine. However, those who grow up participating, even in small responsibilities, tend to develop a sense of organization earlier. Medieval childhood, in this regard, can make us reflect. Shouldn't we include children more in family dynamics, even in simple tasks? And amid these real life lessons, there were also moments of hardship. On cold days, the children suffered as much as their mothers, feeling the biting wind while watching the hard work. Still, they learned to endure, and this early resilience became crucial, especially when winter arrived and brought with it even greater challenges for the washerwomen. The medieval winter was merciless. The winds cut like blades, the frost hardened the ground, and yet the washerwomen continued on to the river or the communal pool. There were no excuses, no long breaks. The laundry needed to be washed. Rain, snow, or wind, imagine hands plunging into icy, almost freezing water repeatedly throughout the day. The cold wasn't an obstacle, it was a constant companion of the routine. The wet clothes weighed even more during this period, making the work twice as much. The fabric, already difficult to wring, seemed to turn to stone under the touch of the cold water. Their backs ached, their fingers went numb, and their entire bodies trembled. Even so, the women didn't give up. It was a lesson in silent resilience, the kind that teaches that duty doesn't choose time or season. The work had to go on, with or without comfort. Interestingly, this effort in the cold also brought the group closer together. The washerwomen warmed themselves in each other's presence, exchanging words, laughter, and even songs to momentarily forget their discomfort. It was as if friendship were an invisible blanket, able to provide warmth when the sun wasn't cooperating. The pain of the cold, shared, seemed to weigh less heavily. The collective spirit was, once again, the great remedy against the harshness of the day. Compared to today, it's like someone complaining about getting up early on a cold morning to face work. The difference is that in our time we have hot coffee, thick coats, heating, even a heated shower. For the medieval washerwoman, none of this existed. The cold was faced head on, with no escape. This contrast makes us appreciate even more the comforts we have today, almost invisible to those who enjoy them every day. But we mustn't forget that the extreme cold took its toll. Many washerwomen fell ill, contracting colds, bronchitis, and even more serious illnesses. Prolonged exposure to such adverse conditions weakened the body. Still, there was no leave or leave of absence. Life went on, and with it the weight of damp clothes. It was a silent sacrifice, rarely remembered in the histories of the time. And precisely because of the sacrifice, an inevitable question arises. If the cold was already a constant enemy, what about the invisible risks, such as the diseases that spread through the water and threaten the health of the washerwomen? Medieval washerwomen not only faced the intense cold, but also the invisible dangers hidden in the water. Rivers and tanks were shared, with animals received waste from the village itself, and often served multiple purposes simultaneously. Washing clothes in such an environment meant immersing one's hands every day in a veritable broth of microorganisms. Skin diseases, infections, and even epidemics could silently arise there. Constant contact with icy water weakened the body. Hands cracked, feet hardened, and small wounds became open doors for infection. Imagine working with exposed cuts day after day without any advanced hygiene measures. Today, We have ointments, antibiotics, and sterile bandages. In the Middle Ages, all that was left was to pray that the wound wouldn't turn into something worse. It was vulnerability in its rawest form. Furthermore, dirty water was a vehicle for serious diseases. Typhoid fever, diarrhea, and other illnesses were common, and washerwomen were on the front lines of this exposure. At that time, no one knew what a bacteria or a virus was. What was perceived was only the result: weakened bodies, absences from the river, stories of pain circulating among the women. Science had not yet named the invisible enemy they faced daily. Interestingly, even in the face of so much risk, the work didn't stop. There was an implicit understanding that life was full of dangers, and that avoiding the river wasn't an option. This detail makes us reflect on how, today, we have access to so many preventative measures, and yet we resist adopting them. How often does someone ignore the use of gloves, sunscreen, or vaccinations without realizing that centuries ago, people would have given anything for this kind of protection? It's also important to remember the psychological aspect. Living under constant risk without fully understanding its causes must have generated a mixture of fear and resignation. Yet the washerwomen found the strength to laugh, sing, and carry on. This is proof that human resilience depends not only on external conditions, but also on the ability to create meaning in the face of adversity. They not only washed clothes, but also learned to live with the unknown. And in this scenario of invisible risks, another burden was added: social. It wasn't enough to deal with dirty water and disease. There was also the stigma of performing a job considered inferior. The washerwomen's social position, so vital yet undervalued, profoundly shaped their daily lives. In the medieval hierarchy, washerwomen occupied a discreet, almost invisible place. Despite being indispensable to daily life, they were seen as women of low prestige, tied to a job considered too menial to deserve recognition. There were no titles, no honor, only sweat and anonymity. The irony is that, without them, even the nobility would have struggled to present themselves with the dignity society demanded. This inferior position reflected the mentality of the time, in which manual tasks were often devalued. Manual labor was associated with poverty, while intellectual or military activities received glory and prominence. It was as if cleaning clothes was so trivial that it deserved no praise, even though it was essential. And this logic is still repeated today when essential professions are undervalued. Interestingly, this lack of prestige didn't erase the washerwomen's practical importance. They were, in fact, invisible pillars of the village. If they were absent for even a few days, chaos would soon ensue. It's similar to when there's a power outage or garbage collection in the modern world. We quickly realize our dependence on what once seemed like a mere detail. Prestige was denied, but the need was ever present. This contrast also shaped these women's self-esteem. They grew up knowing their work would be vital, but never celebrated. What remained was the silent pride, passed down from mother to daughter, that keeping clothes clean was more than a service. It was a contribution to the social order. It was an intimate internal prestige that never translated into public recognition, a silent glory hidden beneath the sound of running water. At the same time, their inferior position also brought a certain freedom. Precisely because they were ignored by the elite, the washerwomen created their own spaces of expression, their own support networks. On the river, they were neither nobles nor peasants. They were simply women united by the same task. There, they built a parallel community where official prestige mattered little. It was the strength of the collective against society's indifference. And, in this paradoxical relationship of contempt and necessity, a new layer of medieval life emerged. Who, after all, hired these washerwomen? Often it was monasteries and convents, where monks and nuns depended directly on this silent service. And this link between washerwomen and the religious life of the time opens another interesting door. Many medieval monasteries, despite valuing a life of simplicity and prayer, depended directly on washerwomen to keep their clothes in order. The monks' cassocks, worn daily in rituals and work, needed to be clean, and it was unusual for them to dedicate themselves to this task. Thus, the village women were called upon to take on this role. The river, in this case, also became an extension of religious life. This proximity between washerwomen and monasteries created a curious relationship. On one side, men dedicated to contemplation and study. On the other, women of low social standing but great practical importance. It was a silent, almost invisible partnership that revealed the interdependence between spirituality and manual labor. While the monks prayed for the sins of the world, the washerwomen ensured that their robes remained dignified. It's interesting to consider how this bond reinforced the idea of service. For many, washing monks' clothes was almost a form of indirect devotion. Helping to keep the religious vestments clean meant contributing to the community's spiritual routine. In a way, it was a way of uniting faith and practice, where even rudimentary soap had its sacred role. Simple work gained a greater, almost liturgical dimension. At the same time, there was a clear contrast. While the monks received respect, donations, and recognition, the washerwomen remained anonymous. It was an unequal relationship, but one both parties accepted out of necessity. The women provided some sustenance, and the monasteries maintained their routines intact. The paradox was clear. The monastery's sanctity was only possible because invisible hands took care of the daily dirt. This contact also opened the door to cultural exchanges. Many washerwomen listened to sermons or advice from the monks and ended up absorbing spiritual practices into their own lives. At the same time, they brought to the monastery news from the village, gossip, and stories that the monks would otherwise have had little access to. It was a two-way street, prayer on one side, information on the other. The river, once again, was a place for unlikely encounters, and it was precisely from this relationship of need and exchange that another striking aspect emerged: the way the washerwomen were compensated for their services. After all, if there was no prestige, payment became their main source of income. But this payment often didn't come in coins. The work of washerwomen was rarely rewarded with regular wages, as we imagine today. Most often, payment came in various forms. Some received a few coins, others received food, and often what was offered were used clothes discarded by nobles or clergy. This system demonstrated how flexible but also unequal the medieval economy was. After all, there was not always justice in the value of services. Coins, when they did appear, were almost always scarce. Gold and silver circulated little among the lower classes, so washerwomen rarely saw large sums. Payment in kind was more common: sacks of wheat, pieces of salted meat, jugs of milk. These goods, though simple, were of enormous value, as they ensured the family's immediate survival. What went into the basket was as important as what went into the pocket. Receiving used clothing was also a common practice. Interestingly, these pieces, often already worn, represented a rare opportunity for the most humble families. An old monk's tunic or a faded dress of a noblewoman could be adjusted, mended, and brought back to life on another body. What was considered old to some became valuable to others. This was the logic of reuse long before the word sustainability existed. This type of payment in goods reminds us of how distant medieval life was from the monetary economy we know today. For washerwomen, value was not just in coins, but in what met basic needs. Today, we complain when a salary is late. Back then, insecurity was constant, and receiving a loaf of bread or a used cloth could mean relief from an immediate problem. Essentials always came first. Still, frustration reigned. Many washerwomen felt their effort was not rewarded. Spending hours with cracked hands and aching arms, only to receive only the equivalent of a meal, was disheartening. But there was no alternative. Life demanded persistence. This disparity reinforces how this profession, vital to everyone, remained undervalued and relegated to anonymity. And even though they earned little, the washerwomen found satisfaction in a simple detail: watching clean clothes dry in the wind, releasing a distinctive scent. The scent of natural cleanliness, mixed with the sun and the freshness of the water, was a symbolic reward, invisible but striking, and it is precisely this scent, so unique, that deserves to be remembered. After all the effort, there was a silent reward: the smell of clothes drying in the wind. There were no artificial perfumes or floral fabric softeners, but there was something purer: the scent of running water mixed with sunlight. The simple scent woven into the fabrics symbolized freshness and cleanliness. It was a reminder that the hard work had paid off and that life could somehow be felt through the nose. The washerwomen knew how to distinguish this unmistakable odor. It was the scent of victory over dirt, over the weight of sodden fabric, over the fatigue that bent their backs. As they gathered the dry clothes, each family recognized the result of their collective labor. Today, many still say that nothing beats the smell of laundry on the line. Perhaps this phrase has deep roots, unconsciously inherited from centuries ago, when the wind was the only fragrant ally. This scent also became a memory. Children grew up associating the freshness of clean clothes with maternal care. Adults, when wearing a freshly dried robe, felt not only comfort, but also security. It was as if the scent were an extension of home, invisible but present. Even the simple act of lying down on clean sheets became a cozy experience, as essential as the warmth of a fireplace on cold nights. Interestingly, this natural scent was also different in each season. In summer, it had notes of heat and dust. In autumn, it recalled dry leaves. In winter, it brought the sharp chill of the air. And in spring, it mingled with the scent of the surrounding flowers. Each dry garment carried a bit of the environment, as if it were a fragment of nature itself stored within the fabric. It was a poetic detail amidst the harshness of medieval life. Today, many seek to artificially recreate this sensation. Industrial perfumes attempt to imitate the smell of clean laundry, but they rarely achieve the simple purity of wind and sun. It's a reminder that no matter how advanced technology may be, there are experiences that only nature can offer. The scent of a medieval clothesline is one of those small miracles that can't be contained in a bottle. And if the smell was so valued, there was also a curious belief that the quality of the water directly influenced the final result. For many washerwomen, simply washing wasn't enough. They had to trust in the purity of the spring that fed the river, or In the minds of medieval washerwomen, not all water was created equal. It was believed that the purity of the source determined the cleaning efficiency. Clear flowing rivers were seen as true treasures. Cloudy or stagnant waters were avoided whenever possible. There were no scientific studies to explain this, but there was practical observation. Clothes washed in crystal clear water always seemed fresher, lighter, and even brighter. This belief reflected folk wisdom passed down from generation to generation. Women knew from experience that certain points on the river worked best. Some would walk long distances just to reach a spring considered pure. The extra effort was seen as an investment because the results were worth it. It's similar to how people today prefer to spend more time going to a specific supermarket because they believe the products are of superior quality. Interestingly, the purity of water also carried religious symbolism. It was believed that clean water not only washed fabrics, but also warded off spiritual impurities. It's no wonder that many baptism rituals took place in crystal clear rivers or springs. For washerwomen, this detail created an invisible connection between the act of cleaning clothes and the idea of purifying the soul. It was as if the fabric emerged renewed inside and out. This practical insight made sense, albeit intuitively. Clean water truly helped remove dirt better, and the crystal clear current reduced the risk of contamination. Even without microscopes or laboratories, the washerwomen were already practicing a rudimentary form of empirical science. They observed, tested, compared results, and adjusted their choices. This knowledge was born from daily practice, not from books. But purity wasn't always available. During droughts or in more populated regions, water became scarce and polluted. In these cases, washerwomen had to adapt, using what was available, even knowing the results would be inferior. This resignation once again revealed the resilience of those who had no choice. After all, dirty clothes couldn't wait for the perfect river. And when many women simultaneously sought the same clean water points, another interesting detail emerged: competition for space. After all, each washerwoman wanted to secure the best spot, and this could turn the work into a stage for petty rivalries. The washerwomen's work wasn't always marked by harmony and cooperation. When many women gathered around the same river or communal pool, disputes over space inevitably arose. Each woman wanted to secure the best spot, where the current was strongest, where the rocks were smoothest, where the sun shone best for drying. Space was limited, and daily life often gave way to small conflicts. These disputes were rarely violent, but they expressed themselves in sidelong glances, harsh words, and even in the gossip that circulated afterward. The simple act of arriving early at the river was a strategy to avoid trouble. Whoever arrived first got the best spot. Whoever was late had to settle for the more difficult spots. It was a kind of silent rule, enforced by force, but which maintained a minimum of order. Interestingly, this dynamic is very reminiscent of modern habits. Think of people competing for seats on public transportation, parking spaces, or even tables in crowded cafes. The essence is the same. Good places are few, and human coexistence always creates mechanisms of competition. Medieval washerwomen already experienced this daily in a simple but revealing way. The river, in this sense, was a microcosm of society. These conflicts also demonstrated the importance of the collective. Despite the tensions, the women knew they needed to coexist. There was no avoiding contact, since they all depended on the same water. Thus, They learned to resolve differences quickly, lest their routine become an endless battlefield. Respect for others' space was earned through practice, often after arguments that were lost in the sound of the water. It's interesting to consider how these disputes were, at their core, a reflection of something larger, the struggle for survival in a world of limited resources. Water, space, time, everything was precious and needed to be fought for. This mentality, so prevalent in the Middle Ages, still resonates today, as we realize that despite all the progress, we continue to compete for resources. The difference is that now the scenarios are different. Companies, cities, markets, and amid these silent disputes, there were also moments of truce, especially when the work involved religious or noble garments, which required extra care, everyone united in respect. And this brings us to another curious aspect, how the washerwomen's lives connected directly to church norms and the demands of the liturgical world. Among all the garments that passed through the washerwomen's hands, few required as much care as liturgical vestments. Cassocks, tunics, and altar cloths were not just pieces of fabric, they carried symbolic and spiritual weight. The church established strict rules, and any failure could be seen as disrespectful. For these women, washing religious garments was almost an act of devotion, requiring extra care. The washerwomen knew they couldn't treat a cassock as they would a peasant tunic. Their care began with the choice of water, which had to be as clean as possible. The scrubbing process was more delicate, so as not to damage fine fabrics or embroidery. Drying in the sun, in this case, also required vigilance. No stains or oversights were allowed. It was as if every detail was observed, not only by men but also by God. This relationship created an interesting contrast. On one hand, the hard, repetitive, and arduous work. On the other, the awareness that they were dealing with something sacred. For many washerwomen, it was a rare opportunity to symbolically approach religious life, even without holding positions within the church. It was like participating, albeit indirectly, in the rituals that marked the life of the community. Simple service took on greater meaning. The curious thing is that even under such care, there was no prestige. Unlike those who preached sermons or led masses, the laundresses remained invisible, hidden behind clean clothes that no one stopped to appreciate. It was a silent contribution that kept the liturgy impeccable in the eyes of the people. Today, perhaps we can compare them to those professionals who, behind the scenes, ensure everything runs smoothly without appearing in the credit. Still, the responsibility weighed heavily. A mistake could be costly. A persistent stain, a poorly repaired tear, and criticism would soon follow. It was an unfair burden, since the resources were not always within their reach. But even so, they carried out their task with discipline, aware that the religious order did not tolerate mistakes. The clean cassock was not merely aesthetic, it was a reflection of the holiness they sought to convey. And while they devoted so much effort to sacred garments, the washerwomen couldn't help but notice the difference in treatment compared to common clothes. After all, washing for nobles and religious people wasn't the same as washing for peasants. And this distinction reveals an even deeper aspect, how social hierarchy was reflected even in the way fabrics were cleaned. The washerwomen soon realized that not all clothes were created equal. Those of the common people, made of rough, resistant fabrics, could be beaten vigorously, wrung carelessly, and even rubbed against rougher stone. The clothes of noble families, however, required a different approach. They were more delicate, made of fine linen or with embroidered details. Treatment varied according to social class, reflecting the hierarchy of the time. Interestingly, the physical effort didn't diminish with the fine fabrics, it simply changed shape. Instead of brute force, patience was needed. Gentle scrubbing, attention to detail, and often repeated processes were required to achieve the desired whiteness. The peasant's clothing simply needed to be clean, the nobleman's needed to shine, reflecting status. It was almost an artistic challenge, requiring both skill and attention. This difference also revealed a paradox. The clothes of the poor, although easier to replace when torn, received less care because no one demanded perfection. The clothes of the rich, which could be replaced more easily, were treated as treasures. It's a logic that spans centuries. The value of things lies not in the object itself, but in what it represents socially. In this case, it represented power and distinction. For the washerwomen, dealing with this difference also meant dealing with inequalities. If they made a mistake with a peasant tunic, little was said, but a careless approach to noble clothing could have serious consequences, from loss of pay to a bad reputation. The symbolic weight of the fabric shifted the weight of responsibility. It was as if each garment carried not only dirt, but also expectation, and expectation was often more difficult to remove than stain. Still, many washerwomen developed their own techniques to ensure the best results. They used herbal infusions, soaked fabrics for longer, and sought out the clearest spots on the river. They created silent tricks, passed down by word of mouth, that became trade secrets. It was practical wisdom, gleaned not from books, but from the water's edge, an expertise known only to those who lived the trade. And, ultimately, this difference between common and noble clothing made one important point clear. White, well kept garments were more than clothing, they were status symbols. And this brings us to the next point, which shows how the color white, in particular, carried social significance far beyond aesthetics. In the Middle Ages, wearing white clothes was a privilege reserved for the few. Maintaining a light-colored fabric required extra effort from washerwomen who spent hours repeatedly rinsing, beating, and exposing the fabric to long periods of sunlight. Unlike dark fabrics, which hid stains, white exposed any carelessness. Thus, those who paraded around in impeccably white clothing demonstrated not only wealth, but also power over other people's time and labor. This status symbol was reflected in every detail. The whiter the garments, the greater the family's prestige. It was as if color served as a social calling card, revealing who had the resources to maintain so many careful washes. Today, we can compare it to the luxury of owning a high-maintenance car or a sophisticated watch. More than just utility, it was a demonstration of power. White, back then, was a silent cry of superiority. For the washerwomen, caring for these garments was almost a personal challenge. Scrubbing with ash or rudimentary soap wasn't enough. It took dedication and patience to achieve the desired shine. Many developed their own techniques, such as using bleaching herbs or exposing the fabrics to morning light for longer. Each trick was kept secret, passed down from mother to daughter, like a kind of professional inheritance. But the symbolic weight also brought pressure. Any flaw in a white garment could mean severe reprimands, loss of pay, or even defamation. What for the nobles was a symbol of prestige, for the washerwomen was a source of anxiety. The light-colored fabric represented both opportunity and risk. With each piece washed, there was an implicit test of competence, and the woman's reputation was at stake along with the garment. It's curious to note how this logic persists to this day. White clothing still carries an aura of elegance and care. A well ironed white shirt, a spotless white dress, a light colored sheet all convey the same message of cleanliness, prestige, and discipline, perhaps without realizing it. We still echo the medieval mentality when we associate the color white with sophistication and power. And amid this relentless pursuit of the perfect white, a cruel reminder also emerged. For many washerwomen, all this effort was not a choice, but an imposition. Work was seen as a duty, not as an option for refusal. And this brings us to the next point, which reveals how their routine was perceived as an inevitable obligation, not a lifestyle choice. For medieval washerwomen, washing clothes wasn't an option, it was an obligation. The work didn't arise from vocation or desire, but from the pure and simple need to survive. The accumulated dirty laundry didn't wait. It was necessary to maintain community order. There was no room for questions like, "Do you like what you do?" That was a non existent reflection in a world where the priority was simply staying alive. This sense of duty was fraught with resignation. From a young age, the girls grew up watching their mothers and grandmothers by the river, and they understood that one day they would be in the same place. It wasn't a matter of choice, but of social destiny. Just as the sons of peasants knew they would inherit the fields, the daughters of washerwomen inherited the stone, the bucket, and the rudimentary soap. It was an invisible inheritance, passed down from generation to generation. This sense of obligation also shaped the way they approached work. There was no room for complaining because complaining didn't change anything. What existed was discipline: waking up, walking to the river, scrubbing, wringing, hanging, and returning home. Day after day, without much variation. It's curious to think how today we have the freedom to change careers, experiment with paths, and reinvent routines. In the past, this luxury simply didn't exist. Yet, within the weight of duty, there was room for meaning. Some washerwomen saw their work as a way to serve the community, to ensure dignity for all. Others found comfort in socializing with friends, transforming their burden into a social moment. This ability to make sense of the inevitable is a powerful lesson. Even when we can't change our circumstances, we can change how we experience them. It's interesting to compare this mentality with today's. How often do we still view our jobs as mere obligations rather than conscious choices? The parallel is clear. The difference is that now there are alternatives, even if not everyone sees them. What was once destiny can now be a decision, but the feeling of "I have to do it, no matter if I like it," remains very present in many lives. And within this atmosphere of constant duty, ways to make the work less arduous also emerged. One of these was the habit of singing while washing, creating simple, repetitive melodies that accompanied the rhythm of the body. And it is precisely in this musical detail that we find another curious layer to the washerwomen's routine. Between the sound of clothes hitting the stones and the rushing water, there was another element that filled the atmosphere: songs. The washerwomen, amidst their repetitive efforts, created simple songs with short, rhythmic choruses. These melodies helped mark the pace of their work, making the effort less onerous. It was as if each verse breathed life into tired hands, transforming fatigue into an almost choreographed movement. These songs weren't complex, but they were powerful, repetitive, and memorable. They were passed down from generation to generation, creating an oral tradition. Some spoke of everyday life, others contained proverbs or even short prayers, They were functional songs, written not to entertain, but to sustain. It's curious how, even without realizing it, they created a kind of collective soundtrack for hard work. The singing also had a psychological effect. Instead of focusing solely on the pain in their arms and the cold water, the washerwomen lost themselves in the rhythm of the music. It was a rudimentary form of active meditation, similar to how people today run while listening to music or work with headphones on. The song filled the inner silence, dispelling negative thoughts and providing a sense of companionship, even when the voices faded into the distance. Interestingly, this practice wasn't exclusive to washerwomen. Sailors, soldiers, and peasants also used repetitive chants to maintain rhythm and alleviate the harshness of their daily lives. Music, in this sense, functioned as a tool for emotional survival. It's as if humans have always turned to sound to transform effort into a more bearable experience. Melody became as important as physical strength. Furthermore, these songs had a social role. By singing together, women created stronger bonds, synchronizing voices and movements. It was almost impossible not to feel part of something larger when all the gestures and sounds aligned. Singing reinforced the sense of community, of belonging, that no one was alone in this work, and this invisible union was as essential as the water itself. And as much as music helped ease the burden, there was one enemy no song could disguise: the growing filth in the rivers, often polluted by urban life itself. This problem made the task even more arduous, revealing another constant challenge in the washerwomen's daily routine. Although rivers were a source of life and cleanliness, they also bore the brunt of urban filth. In medieval cities, it was common for food scraps, animal waste, and even human waste to be dumped directly into the water. This made the washerwomen's task even more complicated, as the place they were supposed to purify often ended up spreading more impurities. It was a cruel paradox, washing clothes in the same water used to dispose of garbage. Urban filth not only hindered the process, but also created contamination risks. Fabrics that should have come out clean sometimes returned impregnated with unpleasant odors or persistent stains. The washerwomen, even without understanding the biological causes, realized that certain parts of the river were unsuitable. This necessitated traveling further, searching for spots where the current could still clean. This scenario demonstrates how the coexistence between urban progress and nature was marked by tension. As towns and cities grew, the more rivers suffered from pollution. Washerwomen were direct witnesses to this transformation, feeling the consequences of collective neglect on their bodies and hands. It's curious to think that, centuries later, we face the same dilemmas on a much larger scale, with polluted rivers and seas choked with plastic. Dirt also intensified competition for space. Women concentrated on the cleanest stretches, which increased rivalries and tensions. Choosing where to wash clothes often became a real logistical challenge. The work, already arduous, became even more arduous when essential resources were scarce. This was medieval reality anticipating modern problems of environmental management and unequal access to water. Still, there was a sense of adaptation. Some washerwomen devised alternative techniques, such as using containers to store relatively clean water and avoiding the most polluted areas. Others simply accepted the inevitable, washing what they could and relying on the sun to mask the odor. This practical resilience demonstrates the human capacity to carry on, even when conditions seem unfavorable. Medieval life was largely this: improvising to survive. And amidst the urban filth and hardships, a symbolic image remained, that of washerwomen gathered together, side by side, building a collective routine. This image, which spanned generations, left a cultural legacy that survives to this day, transforming the figure of the washerwoman into a symbol of female and community work. Over the centuries, the figure of the washerwoman went from being merely a memory of physical exertion to a true cultural symbol. They represented more than women by the river. They represented the collective strength of female labor, which sustained the community without expecting applause. Each thud of clothes against the stone echoed as a reminder that the world only works because there are those who take care of the invisible tasks. This legacy has endured through time. The image of the washerwoman appears in paintings, poems, and even popular songs, always associated with simplicity and perseverance. Even when seen as a symbol of humility, she also carries an aura of resilience. After all, how many generations of women were shaped by the same routine, repeating identical gestures until they became part of the landscape itself? It was a craft that didn't disappear at the end of the day, but rather perpetuated itself in the collective imagination. This legacy also reflects today. When we talk about women's empowerment, we often forget that the foundation of this movement began with those who, even in silence, supported entire families. The medieval washerwoman didn't have fiery speeches or written manifestos, but her life was in itself an act of resistance. Working, persisting, and teaching her daughters the same craft was, in a way, perpetuating the struggle. Interestingly, in many cultures, the washerwoman has become a folkloric figure. Some stories describe her as a wise counselor, others as a suffering woman marked by fate. Regardless of the version, the essence is the same, a figure who symbolizes effort, dedication, and community. It's as if humanity recognized, albeit belatedly, that this invisible work deserved a special place in social memory. In modern times, the image of the washerwoman also serves as a metaphor. How many of us in our daily lives aren't washers in some way? People who, day after day, repeat silent, unglamorous, but absolutely necessary tasks, caring for children, maintaining a home, performing tasks without immediate recognition. All of this echoes the same essence. The medieval symbol lives on, albeit in different settings. And so, the washerwoman ceased to be merely a medieval figure and became a universal archetype, the woman who, as a group, carries the weight of the world on her shoulders without losing her humanity. And it is in this spirit of resistance and collectivity that we can pave the way for a powerful introduction capable of connecting past and present in an engaging way. Now that you've witnessed the silent routine of medieval washerwomen, tell me, how often have you undervalued the small, everyday tasks? Have you also overlooked the power hidden in what seems mundane? After all, if clean clothes could sustain the dignity of an entire village, what might your small gestures today sustain in the future? Think about it. Maybe you don't need to move mountains to transform your life. Maybe the secret lies in persisting with discipline in the simple, repetitive things, just as they did. What seems boring may be precisely what shapes your character, your story, and even the legacy you leave to others. And I want to challenge you. What have you been doing every day in silence that could be shaping your destiny without you realizing it? Isn't it time to give more value to the invisible, to what sustains, to what no one applauds but makes everything work? If this reflection resonated with you, let me know in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here you'll continue discovering how the past holds powerful lessons for your life today.